we are confronted by a very troubling fiscal reality. A difficult economic climate, fiscal pressure from Albany, and uncertainty from Washington, D.C. all shaped this year's budget. Like other city agencies, we were tasked with finding savings to help close the city's budget gap. We sought to minimize the impact of school budgets, yet had to make some very hard choices. Our savings initiatives included tens of millions of dollars in administrative savings through a central hiring freeze, finding efficiencies in procurement, and improving revenue claiming. We also had to eliminate the renewal hour earlier than originally planned and are working with school leaders to identify other available extended learning opportunities. The Mayor's executive budget for the Department of Education is approximately $33.9 billion for the fiscal year 2020. And DOE's funding is comprised of city, state, and federal resources, with city tax levy making up the largest portion. Our funding is approximately 57% city tax levy dollars and 36% state dollars, with only 6% federal dollars. This executive budget includes new targeted investments to help us advance our equity and excellence for all agenda. This will bring 3K for all to 2 additional districts next year, bringing the citywide total to 14 districts by September of 2020. As part of the DOE's reorganization, I created the position of Chief Academic Officer to ensure comprehensive instructional supports are in place for all learners, including students with disabilities. The budget continues this administration's commitment to meeting the needs of our students with disabilities by providing an additional $33 million in new resources dedicated to special education. These resources will support pilot programs for students with autism and print-based disabilities and allow us to hire more clinicians to improve the timeliness and quality of individual education plans. The executive budget also baselines $11.9 million in initiatives targeted towards students in temporary housing, including our Bridging the Gap program that brings social workers to the elementary schools, serving those students, and our after-school reading clubs in the DHS shelters. It also includes funding for the CSS approach that I mentioned earlier. The executive plan continues this administration's substantial investments in the Fair Student Funding Formula, and to date, more than $800 million has been dedicated to raising the FSF floor. As the Council knows well, when this administration started, the FSF floor was 81%, and the average school had an FSF level of 87%. Thanks to this administration's investments and help from the Council, the FSF floor is now at 90%, and the system-wide average is 93%. We know that we must do more to guarantee that every school in the city has the resources it needs to put each and every student on the path to success. However, the city cannot do this alone. I, like you, was disappointed that for yet another year the Senate has left the promise of the campaign for fiscal equity unfulfilled, shortchanging our students by $1.1 billion in fiscal year 2020. I cannot thank the Council enough for your staunch advocacy in Albany to get the funds from the state that our students need and, more importantly, are owed. I know you are in this fight for the long haul and believe that the FSF task force that was created by Councilmember Traeger's legislation will yet again demonstrate to the state that our commitment to equity directly translates to how we fund our schools. From free, full-day, high-quality pre-K for all to the soaring number of students taking and passing computer science exams, to steady gains on state exams, to the highest high school graduation rates on record, we have a great deal to be proud of, yet we know we have much more work to do. So thanks to the talented educators and leadership from the Mayor and partnership with the City Council, I am confident that together we will make even faster progress in enabling all of our students to reach their full potential. I want to thank you for your time, and with that, I would like to turn it over to President Lorraine Grillo, who will discuss the proposed 5-year capital plan.
Thank you, Chancellor, and thank you, Chairs Traeger and Drum. It's a pleasure to be here again. I will be very brief and go through the capital plan as it's proposed. The highlights of this plan include $8 billion for nearly 58,000 new seats in fulfillment of the Mayor's commitment to reduce overcrowding. $750 million to make 50% of elementary school buildings partially or fully accessible, and 1/3 of all buildings fully accessible. $284 million for the electrical work to support air conditioning in all classrooms by 2021, advancing that program by 1 year. $565.5 million in support of the 3K and Pre-K for All initiative, and $750 million for technology enhancements. Our capacity program is scheduled for a total of $8.9 billion, capital investments at $5.7 billion, and mandated programs at $3.5 billion. That's a total of $18.1 billion. Capacity includes several categories. New capacity, that's new seats, is $8.02 billion. 3K and Pre-K early education is $565 million. Class size reduction is $150 million. And capacity needed to remove some transportable classrooms is $180 million. Under new capacity, we're proposing funding for 57,965 seats, and that includes an estimated 91 school buildings. 86 are PS and IS buildings. There has been a slight addition to this, and that includes District 30 in Queens, which will be Parcel C, a new parcel in Long Island City, and Court Square, a school added to that area. And in addition, there will be 5 ISHS schools in Queens for over 8,000 seats. There is a breakout available to you for all the districts and the seat need within those districts. Then there's the capital improvement section, which is $5.7 billion. Includes $3.01 billion for capital improvement programs. That's our building systems. That includes $2.86 billion, and it really deals with those buildings most in need of repair. It includes upgrades to life safety systems, such as fire alarms and public address systems. Also, site improvements. Then the removal of transportable classroom units, which I know has been a real priority for the council, includes $50 million, which will remove 34 non-capacity dependent transportable classrooms, and another $100 million for athletic field upgrades. Again, the list of those TCUs that we have removed, which is up to 205, and another 75 that are in the process of being removed, which reduces the number of remaining units to 7.
negotiations that we see these concerns addressed. In addition to the advocates, the council has called on the administration to fund pay parity across the early childhood education system. If this city decided to invest in pay parity, what would be the mechanism by which pay parity is achieved? Would the $89 million be added to the DOE's budget?
Again, what I'll do is I'll ask our CFO if she has any additional information, but there are active conversations right now around pay parity with the union and with the providers, and we have pushed in on those conversations. So there is active work and conversation happening around that. Now, the particulars about what would be the funding mechanism, I don't have that detail. I don't think we have that detail yet, but I can tell you that I just received a briefing last week about some of these conversations, and they're moving forward.
Okay. Could DOE issue an addendum or an amendment to an RFP that would clarify that the programs could contract for enough funding to pay their staff equitable salaries with education, the salaries with educators employed directly by the DOE?
So I believe there is a mechanism for an addendum, and part of the conversations that we've been engaged in with these leaders have been what would that look like, if at all, and what would be the parameters of any kind of an addendum.
Okay, funding for early childhood education programs shifted from ACS to DOE without any additional funding allocated for the upcoming RFP. Clearly, the cost of providing these programs are not the same as when the current contracts at ACS were issued. The council, as well as early childhood education providers and advocates, have voiced serious concerns regarding the lack of appropriate funding for the RFP. Will the DOE's budget for early childhood education increase?
The budgeting process, including for this particular issue, is under constant review with new information as we, in real time, are engaging. The RFP is obviously a huge issue for us in terms of working with our community about that, but specifics about increasing the budget is just a little premature at this point, given the stage of conversations that we're engaged in.
At what point do you think we can see it reflected in the financial plan?
You know, Mr. Chair, I wish I could tell you specifically, but I think is, again, ongoing conversations. We're deeply engaged with the leaders, so we hope that this will happen before it actually gets put into practice.
Mr. Chancellor, can you tell us who you're talking with in the early childhood community?
I would prefer at this point, since we've had what we've agreed would be private conversations, to keep them private. We've agreed that because of the sensitivity of what we're doing and how we're talking and what we're talking about, that we would respect each other's privacy. So with no disrespect to the committee, I would prefer that I do not name those individuals at this moment.
So let's follow up maybe with the council a little bit later off the record on some of these things.
Would be happy to.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Chair Traeger now, who's going to ask some questions.
Thank you, Chair Drummond. I'm also going to just start off by, former teacher in me also, has to begin with some words of some positivity, although after these initial words, I think we will get more intense. But Mr. Chancellor, I do appreciate the fact that you stayed, you listened to the students from Teens Take Charge. That was a very powerful, very transpiring session, and of course we just have to make sure that we actualize the vision, and again, integrating our public schools will strengthen them, will improve outcomes for all, just like diversifying Tweed will strengthen Tweed, and in response to some of the outrageous things I've been reading. So I just want to begin by saying that and acknowledging that, and thanking you for that. But I am not a happy camper when it comes to this budget, Mr. Chancellor, so let's get right to it. The headcount report provided to the Council shows an increase of 294 school-based pedagogical headcount, which includes a 542 position increase in school-based teacher titles, offset by decreases in other pedagogical titles. How much of this change is attributable to the $125 million invested in increasing fair student funding this year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your opening remarks as well. We are, I think, there is no space between our positions, so I want to thank you. And I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to delve into those details.
Good morning, Chair Traeger. Thank you for the question. As we've discussed previously, of course, as you know from being a school-based person yourself, there's constantly inflows and outflows of pedagogical headcount in our system through a variety of different reasons. The $125 million investment that you referenced, which raised the fair student funding floor to 90% at the start of last school year, funded a total of approximately 900 positions in our schools this past school year. And most of those were teachers.
Were these new positions or existing positions?
They were teachers that definitely were able to stay in the school this year as a result of the advocacy from you and the mayor's office to get that funding in our schools this past school year.
Which will reinforce a later question of mine, why there's no increase in FSF, but how many new positions? Do you have that with you?
I don't have the breakdown of that, but again, it was approximately 900 positions. Nearly 750 of them were teacher title positions.
And do you have any data on how many social workers or?
There were some social support staff, counselors, and other types of school support staff. I don't have the breakdown by the specific titles with me today.
Did DOE have an initial projections of the headcount increase that would result from FSF? And were there any projections tied to it prior to increasing the budgets?
So as you've referenced, this is the most flexible funding source for schools, and so it's a little bit difficult for us to project in real accuracy around that. But as we've previously testified, we know from our years of raising the floor, and this administration has added over, around $800 million in the fair student funding formula since the start of this administration, that nearly 90% of that funding has gone to support headcount in our schools.
So how did DOE direct principals to use the FSF increase? Was any guidance given on their budgeting decisions? For example, were schools without a social worker directed to use FSF support to provide social emotional supports to students?
So the guidance that principals receive, not only on budgeting but decision-making in their schools, is really based on what the needs are of their school. So if there is a need for that kind of a position in the school, then principals are encouraged to be specific and strategic with using their resources. It would go to one of those positions. The unfortunate reality that we've referenced with the state not funding our schools is that without that additional funding, principals are put in a very difficult position oftentimes. Do I hire a teacher to reduce class size, or do I hire a counselor, or do I hire another kind of position? Those are the tough decisions that principals have to make based on the fact that the state isn't living up to its commitment to fund our schools. But it's always the guidance to principals to use their funding specifically to meet the needs at our school, at the school. And that makes it very difficult to say, thou shalt use it this way, because one size doesn't fit all. So I want to give a little color to what we're saying, because I don't want the impression to be that principals don't get guidance. They absolutely get guidance, but it has to be really based on what the needs are of their particular school.
And judging on from Ms. Oates' answer, it seems that most of the positions were existing positions, which means that they were just paying for the increased cost of our contractual obligations. And I'm certainly respectful and mindful that we have obligations to meet contracts, but the purpose of this increase in support to our schools was to better meet the needs of kids by hiring critical support staff, and whether it's reducing class size, whether it's hiring social workers, counselors. One would imagine that $125 million would make a significant impact in doing that, but I'm a little bit concerned about some of the answers that we're hearing today. And again, Chancellor, I agree with you that the state No one in Albany should be taking a victory lap over the state budget. No one. It actually resulted in a $25 million cut to our school system. So all this talk of schools, not jails, produced a cut to the school system. I just want to note that for all in Albany. Is there a concern that the lack of FSF increase to schools this year will result in a significant increase in excess teachers from schools that experience register declines or increased costs that cannot be covered by a level amount of FSF funding?
So thank you, Chair Traeger, for that question. We are approaching initial allocations for school budgets as thoughtfully as we can. I think when we are in a tight fiscal climate like we are now, we want to make sure that schools understand the resources that they do have available for them, what funding they do have in their budget, and to try to be as thoughtful around how they program those dollars to meet all of their children's needs. I think, as you know, there is a really deep engagement process that takes place over the summer, specifically during the month of June while folks are still in school, looking at what their projected registers are for the upcoming school year and then looking at what their initial allocations are and being as thoughtful as they possibly can around how they can program their classes to support all of their students' needs in the upcoming school year. We work with my team works really closely with the Office of the First Deputy Chancellor's office, with the borough offices to really support as many schools as we possibly can. But again, we're really trying to focus on what schools do have in their budgets and how they can support their students.
Ms. Oates, you refer to our situation at, quote, tight fiscal climate. I'm having a hard time understanding that when the OMB director testified recently, acknowledged that the city is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in new revenue that has come in as a result of personal income tax money. In addition to being the chair of this committee, I'm also a member, just like Chair Drum is, of our budget negotiation team. So I see the same numbers that everyone else sees in the city of New York. We have a budget surplus. We're not in a tight fiscal climate at this time. Now, in the future, there's always questions of certainty. I understand that. But as of this moment, we are not in a tight fiscal climate. There's almost $500 million in additional revenue that just came in after April 15th, which was my birthday as well. But
Happy belated birthday.
yes, it should be a gift to the public school system. So I'm going to respectfully push back against this narrative that we are in tight fiscal times. We're not. And the number one priority for us here is our kids. And I'm concerned that if we do not increase FSF, as you pointed out in your answer to my prior question, new staff that was hired will be accessed because we have a last in, first out system. So if you're a new special education teacher or a new social worker that might have been hired, you might be in danger of losing your job and then accessed into an abyss and hopefully picked up at some point in the future. That's not how our system should work. Our staff, our children, our schools deserve stability and a sense of certainty, especially in a $92 billion budget with hundreds of millions of dollars in added revenue. I want to turn to early childhood education. We understand DOE is requiring that during non-core hours in early childhood education settings, parents must be. The slide is up, so Mr. Chancellor, if you could just take a glance at that. According to what we're hearing and according to what we're seeing, parents must be U.S. citizens or legal immigrants to enroll their students for services during non-core hours. Does this requirement extend to all non-core hours that DOE will contract for, regardless of funding source? If so, why? Mr. Chancellor, are you aware that this was a presentation provided by DOE?
Yeah, so I wasn't aware of this particular slide. This is one of the many grievances that I have with the federal government. There are certain requirements tied to federal funding which make us have certain requirements or lose the funding. We are pushing back on that. And I will tell you that we don't require our parents or our students to have proof of anything except their breathing to get the services that they deserve in New York City. But this is from the best that I can tell, this is one of those federal requirements, and we'll get more detail on this.
And the problem, Mr. Chancellor, and I believe that you do care about all of our children, and you do understand how significantly problematic this is. The fact is, we're going to lose families and children as a result of this policy. We must address this. Do I have DOE's commitment to address this issue immediately so we don't lose one child, one family from these critical services?
Absolutely. This is unacceptable. But I will also, with that commitment, be very clear about how much money we'll lose in federal funding as well. That is not an excuse, but I want to be very transparent that some of these onerous policies that we are forced to implement have significant dollars associated with them as well. And that doesn't mean we don't take them on. It just means we have to be very clear about what the implications are.
All right. Well, I hear you. I think you would agree that we value our children more than outrageous federal strings from a disgraceful federal government right now. We've heard that CBOs providing early childhood education are being asked to pay for their own furniture and technology, even if that technology is required by DOE. In addition, they are being told DOE will not reimburse them for enrichment services such as art and music. Is there a base amount of funding provided to early childhood education CBOs similar to the base amount of funding provided for school budgets? If not, why not?
I'm going to ask our CFO to take that question.
Thank you for the question. So the current structure for how we pay our pre-K providers is a per child amount, and there are some startup costs associated with some of those contracts as we've rolled them out, and those startup costs have paid for the things that you're referencing, furniture and equipment, and so and I can say that under Deputy Chancellor Wallach's team, his team is working really closely with the community-based organizations and really monthly reviewing their budgets and their needs. And so we are doing our best to be responsive to issues that you raise.
Ms. Oates, when it comes to FSF, every school has a base amount of money just to open up shop. I think it's around $225,000 somewhere, thanks to your comprehensive charts that I paid attention to. We need to apply the same thinking and the same strategy to our CBO providers as well, because there are startup costs. They're spending money out of their own budgets to just make sure that their spaces are in compliance with the health department, your regulations, and there's an expectation from DOE for them to use iPads, for example, but they can't use the money that you provide them for iPads. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that specific issue, sir.
Yeah, there's a lot of, Mr. Chancellor, I think we have to add to your plate of conversations that you have, and we like to be a part of that because we want to make sure that there's funding in place to stabilize CBO. I don't say it lightly that because 60% of the UPK services, for example, are provided by our CBO partners. I don't say it lightly that many of them are on the brink. It's not a talking point for me. I want this to work. I want UPK and 3K. I want all this to work. But when I keep hearing from providers from across the boroughs, they can't take this on, they don't have enough resources, they can't retain staff, that's a problem. And from an instructional lens, Mr. Chancellor, kids at 3 years old should not be seeing new adults in front of their class every month or two. That's damaging to instruction. It's damaging to their formative years. So I know there's budgetary implications, but for me, the teacher in me cares about the instruction happening in that classroom. I want to turn now to social workers. In our fiscal 2020 prelim budget response, the Council called for the DOE to dedicate $13.75 million to hire an additional 110 social workers for high-need schools. There are more than 700 schools that do not have a full-time social worker on staff, and for those schools that do not have a social worker and guidance counselor, the ratio of these support staff to students are often egregiously high. Why wasn't this included in the exec budget, especially when the administration exceeded its $750 million target in identifying cost savings, and the administration was able to add over $350 million to DOE's executive budget?
So again, Mr. Chair, we believe very strongly that there should be a robust social-emotional support system at every school. In fact, I created a whole division to focus us on providing those services as well. As it pertains to the budget, I budget what I get. I don't create my budget. I have to live within the means. So I will take your word for it that there is a surplus of funding. I hope that that trickles back to us. I trust that you will push that conversation.
You trust, correct?
Yes. So we believe, again, in social workers. We believe in counselors. I think it's a little more clear to understand in those 700 schools where there, as you've mentioned, no social workers, there are social emotional supports. There are counselors in those schools. It's not as if those schools have no support system. We would like to have more robust staffing, but as I've said, and this is not in any way, shape, or form being dismissive, it's a matter of money. So if we get more money for our schools, if the state would finally live up to its responsibility and fund the fiscal equity plan, that money goes directly to schools, which can be used then to hire these kinds of positions. So we are, as part of our budget process as well, looking to identify internal resources as well that we can add to the resources going to schools. But I want to be very, very clear for everyone that's listening that there aren't bags of money at the DOE. So when we move something, something else gets cut, something else gets impacted, and we want to be very thoughtful that as we're doing that work, we keep that in mind as well so that it's supporting school sites.
So, Mr. Chancellor, I appreciate that answer, but I just have to remind the DOE that in the last budget, the City Council actually stepped up and put in $2 million to hire counselors, $2 million to add more Bridging the Gap social workers. And if it was not for the amazing City Council Finance Division, I'm not sure if these folks would have been hired, because they were hired way past the start of the school year. Many of them were hired in January. And as a matter of fact, I'm being told that not every position has been hired. So when we say that you're budgeting for what you have, you actually did have some revenue that for whatever reason was held up. And so my question is, these hiring restrictions, because it's my understanding that there's still a freeze on hiring counselors and social workers, is that correct?
There, along with every city agency, there is a hiring freeze on all positions. What we've done in the DOE is that school-based positions have the greatest priority, so we are making exceptions to the freeze every day. So as you referenced earlier, there are counselors, there are social workers, there are teachers that have been accessed from other schools. We ask our principals and school communities to look at that pool first. I think it just makes sense that these are, many of them, educators just got accessed. There are no disciplinary issues, there are no issues that would preclude them from being hired. So we do ask our principals to look at that pool first. I think it's fiscally responsible. I think it's also instructionally responsible. And if that list doesn't produce a candidate and they interview a candidate that's external, there is a freeze. There's a process to request that freeze be lifted for that hire, and we do it every day. So the best of my knowledge is that we are not precluding people from hiring these critical positions. The important note here is that they have to have the resources to hire these people. And the campaign for fiscal equity and the funding we're still owed would go a long way to help us get those resources in place.
Right. So is the DOE continuing the freeze into the into the coming school year again?
Again, we're part of the city, and the direction we have is that there is a fiscal issue. There is an austere budget environment, so we have a freeze. But what we have done is prioritized school-facing positions, and as I've mentioned, there is a process for being able to hire into those positions, and that's happening every day.
Mr. Chancellor, we're requesting that if the council funds these positions, which quite frankly we shouldn't have to, but we are because that's how important they are to the council, we're asking that these positions are not subject to these hiring restrictions. And I'd like to get your commitment on that, that if we're funding them, if we want to fund social workers and counselors, adding revenue to DOE's budget, they should not be subject to these freeze restrictions.
So I think we're on the same page here. I just want to be very clear that if it's a position, we have a pool of educators that have those titles. We are going to continue in that same process. You look there first, and then if there's another candidate that schools are going to be free then to hire, and there's a process for then documenting why that is being allowed to go forward. So I think we're talking about the same thing here, sir. We're committed to that as well.
Right, and I'm mindful, I'm very much cognizant of what ATRs are, and I understand that. You know, the excess pool, I'm hearing from schools on the ground that a number of them who they've tried to interview don't show up for whatever reason, and they are just months and months and months in bureaucratic limbo, and the position is not filled in their school. And there is money to hire them. And so I just would like for us to work on this so we don't hire these key staff in the middle of the school year, but we hire them at the start of the school year. So I'm going to move on because I'm going to be mindful of my colleagues' time. But we understand the city is under a compliance assurance plan related to the provision of special education and related services for the 2018-2019 school year. This plan requires an increase in the allocation of staffing resources. Does the investment in the executive budget reflect the DOE's required corrective action? And if yes, can you provide a breakdown of the investments in the executive budget that match the required corrective action in the compliance assurance plan? And if no, how much further investment is required, and when will that investment be reflected in the budget?
So the City of New York, along with other school systems in the state of New York, are under a compliance review and a compliance assurance plan by the State Education Department. The number of other districts, we can get back to you. Part of the investment that is being made in our special education services will help with some of the compliance issues that are included in that CAP plan. We can get you details as specifically what areas and how that's going to be impacted. The bottom line, though, is that as we've worked with the State Education Department, we've been very clear that we aspire to do more than what's in that compliance plan. The compliance plan is what it is. It's about compliance. What we're really trying to do is build a better system that provides services for our students and gives the information and the support to parents they need to make their decisions. So we can come back with more details specifically about how those investments will help with that compliance assurance plan, but we're really looking beyond that compliance assurance plan to build a better system in its entirety.
Right, and I'm just mindful, Mr. Chancellor, you remember that we had a 7-hour hearing on special education here in the City Council, which was very sobering. And the mayor, I understand, highlighted the increased money in terms of Carter cases. My issue with that Carter case is that, number one, many working families that I speak to, never even heard of them before. And even if they did hear of them, they don't have the means to shell out thousands and thousands of dollars to wait for reimbursement that might not even come, because we've heard complaints about long reimbursement wait times. And so we desperately need to make sure that we are in-housing as much as possible, identifying those service gaps within our system, and providing services within the DOE system, and not be at the mercy of the private market.
We are 100% with you. Yes.
DOE is taking savings. I'm turn now to headcount in borough offices, central administration. DOE is taking savings by reducing central administration and borough office headcount as the council recommended. However, the executive budget still reflects a net increase in headcount in both central administration and borough offices. How does DOE justify the need for so many additional central and borough staff? Why aren't these resources being allocated directly to schools?
So I'll ask our CFO to add some more detail to this, but keep in mind that the lessons we learned from, for example, the renewal approach was that embedded coaching at school sites was extremely effective in helping schools instructionally do better. In other words, instead of taking teachers, and as a teacher you'll appreciate this, and taking teachers for training outside of the building and then expecting them to come back and implement, part of that model was that we had coaches that would actually come into the schools, work side by side with teachers, do in-school coaching. Those positions become centralized. They become borough-based because you have to allocate them and they float and they go to different schools. So much of the headcount that you're going to see are around those kinds of embedded coaching type positions that we know from the data here in New York City made a significant impact in some of our most historically underserved schools. I'm going to ask our CFO if she has any additional insight into those numbers as well.
Thank you, Chair. So, again, as we talked about with school-based headcount, our field and central-based headcount is constantly fluctuating. One of the things that DOE participated in, along with all other city agencies, are headcount reductions related to the citywide partial hiring freeze. Those heads will be taken out of our central budget, and we're constantly looking at how we can provide our services centrally and at the field level more efficiently. One of the things that is contributing to perhaps some of the headcount growth that you see is related to some insourcing efforts that are taking place across our field-based offices and some of our central offices to provide permanent staff to functions that may have been staffed in other ways in the past. And so that contributes to some of the potential increase that you're seeing in the budget.
I mean, I'm just looking at the chart that you can see here as well. I'm just having a difficult time grappling with the fact that there are more borough office support staff than social workers in the entire school system. There's something wrong here. And headcount has increased in these borough offices. And respectfully, I am still not clear on all of their roles and responsibilities, because what I am hearing from schools, they want direct services inside their schools. So it's nice to have folks housed somewhere, but schools would like to have social workers or critical services housed in their schools to provide direct services to students, and with the caveat that they are licensed and qualified to provide those services.
So we don't disagree with you, sir. I think what's my analysis as the educator, as the chancellor, is that the system was not set up to provide those just-in-time resources. So I can't expect a social worker that is providing direct services at a school to be responsible for 5 schools and also be responsible for doing professional development and elbow-to-elbow coaching with other social workers. I can't expect a social worker to teach English or to teach math or to teach science, much less be the coach that is helping with the pedagogy of that math teacher, of that science teacher, of that English teacher. So once again, I think we're talking about the same kind of system of supports for instruction and wraparound services at schools. I'm going to reiterate, we are in a difficult budget situation, and we are being as focused as we can to make sure that the resources that we have are supporting what's happening at the school sites. That being said, I would be more than happy to have a briefing session where we can take you through exactly what the strategic plan is and how we're allocating these resources. I will also tell you that I spend a lot of time out in the field, and I completely respect the fact you're hearing from folks. I've got 1,800 people that I hear from. And I can tell you that across the system, what I'm hearing loud and clear from our principals and, quite frankly, our teachers, is that they want this kind of support. And if they see this kind of support being allocated, that they are okay with that. So again, I think a good work session where we could actually go through that plan would be, I think, a good thing for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just respond and I'll move on, Mr. Chancellor, that, I am mindful that you visit schools a lot, and I respect that, I appreciate that. I haven't heard from teachers ask me, help me teach math, but they do ask me, how do I address the trauma that my students are experiencing in their communities and in our schools? I can't reach them. And so it's not just about the quadratic formula, it's about how do I reach kids that are experiencing a whole host of social emotional issues. I'm just trying to be mindful of that. I'm going to move on to school food. According to a report required by Local Law 60 of 2011, in the 2017-2018 school year, only 420 schools had implemented breakfast in the classroom. How many schools are implementing breakfast in the classroom in the current school year?
Our CFO has those numbers.
Thank you, Chair. So as of May of this year, so this month, about 525 schools in 475 buildings have implemented the Breakfast in the Classroom program.
Can you say it one more time? I'm sorry.
Yes. 525 schools in 475 buildings have implemented the Breakfast in the Classroom program as of this month.
Out of how many schools?
Approximately 1,800.
Why isn't this happening across the board?
So I am a big proponent of making sure that our students all have a nutritious breakfast, they have lunch, and in many of our schools, they also get supper. I think breakfast in the classroom, and I've been involved with breakfast in the classroom in 2 other school systems that I've led. I think we need to stop talking about breakfast in the classroom and talk about breakfast in the stomach. It's important that kids have breakfast, and what happens in a system like ours that is so large and so complex is that some of our schools have not been able to just logistically be able to accommodate the breakfast in the classroom. Breakfast in the classroom is important. And in some of those schools it's worked well, and quite frankly, some of those schools it hasn't worked well. So what we have said, and what I have directed in the DOE, is that our goal should be that students get breakfast, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's before they get into the classroom, is really, from my perspective, not as important as they get breakfast. I will also share that we have examples of schools that do not have breakfast in the schools program that have a much higher participation rate than some of the schools that have breakfast in the classroom. So it really is about making sure that students are getting the food, and then they're getting food that they want to eat and that is nutritious and healthy. So I do not want to discount breakfast in the classroom, but I also want to be really clear that if a school does not have a breakfast in the classroom implementation, it doesn't mean that students are not getting fed. And we're really monitoring what are the participation rates in our schools. And again, would be happy to sit with you and your staff and share those numbers as well.
Mr. Chancellor, I know this program rolled out prior to your arrival, but what I want to share with you is that, and again, I hear directly from schools, is that there was very little guidance as far as implementation of the program. And you couple that with the fact that in the last budget, in the middle of the school year, DOE took away money from custodians' budgets in our schools, which the DOE counted as surpluses, which they count as reserves because they wait until spring break, for example, when the buildings are clear, to clean the building. And so if you cut custodian budgets, cut janitor budgets, that's why some schools have difficulty with implementation, because the issue is who cleans the spilled milk or the spilled orange juice. These are fixable items. This is not rocket science to address. And I just don't think we should drop the ball on this critical initiative. And I understand that kids can get technically options elsewhere, but one of the reasons why this program was established, because many school communities, for whatever reason, that right or that information never trickled down to the kids. This way, you ensure that they're eating. You ensure that they are receiving their nutrition. There's no ambiguity around nutrition. Because you agree with me that kids cannot learn if they're hungry. And they don't always know that they have a right to go downstairs and ask to the cafeteria. This program was set up to address and to remove any ambiguity or confusion about their rights in the schools. Last thing, because I turn to my colleagues, in fiscal 2019, the council funded a halal and kosher school lunch pilot. We understand this pilot rolled out at 9 schools last month. Can you tell us how much DOE expects to spend on this pilot this year? And can you tell us how many kosher halal meals DOE expects to serve? We assume DOE had to estimate this in order for the appropriate vendors to be prepared to provide meals.
So I could tell you the pilot is currently active in 10 schools, and in 10 schools, students can receive a kosher or halal meal today. Lots of lessons learned in this pilot program. As you know, we've met numerous times with council staff and council members. We appreciate your support in that. But for example, for halal, the council may be very aware of this, but the public may not be aware. And even I wasn't aware that if you're going to have a halal option for students, there surely must be somebody that prepares that, and we can just order a halal meal. It's much more complex than that. We actually brought in imams that came into the preparation facility of the selected vendor and had to ensure that the way the meals were being prepared was in accordance to all of the regulations and guidelines. Then they had to go into our schools, every one of those 10 schools, and again, review, work with the school nutrition staff and ensure that they're being prepared according to the guidelines. Then the particular sourcing of the meals. So for example, if there is chicken, how is the chicken being slaughtered, and are they following incredibly complex? But I think we did it right in that we included the community, we included the religious community, we made sure that everybody was guiding us as how we went forward. And that's part of why we have these 10 pilot schools, and we're learning more and more about that every single day. We would not have been able to do that without the support of the council, because it was incredibly important to be able to have that kind of a robust process. In terms of the specific numbers, in terms of salary, and not salary, in terms of budget, as I've mentioned, we are right in the midst of the pilot. So what I will commit to doing is getting as much of that information as we can, and then sharing that in written form.
I would really appreciate that information, Mr. Chancellor, because we're in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, which is an issue for many of our Muslim students, and we have less than a month left in school. So the pilot was supposed to be rolled out this school year, and we just still don't have clarity on how many meals were served, but we would like to follow up with your folks, senior folks, to make sure that this is addressed expeditiously. And I'm going to turn to my colleagues over, but Mr. Chancellor, this morning before I came to this hearing, I stood on the steps of City Hall with these extraordinary students and staff here of MS-50 in Brooklyn, where a promise was made to them that we would not cut a dime in any of the Renewal Rise schools. And I said not a dime should be cut for extended learning time. In this school, the program is working. We're seeing improved results. We don't cut things. First of all, we shouldn't break promises to kids. And we should not cut what is working for our school communities. And again, I'm going to push back against this narrative that we're in tight fiscal times. Any city across, whether it's, Mr. Chancellor, whether it's Houston or San Francisco or New York City, any city that has $500 million in surplus revenue, that is not tight fiscal time. We have the money and the responsibility to restore every single cut that is proposed in this executive budget. We have a commitment to these kids. And that's why we are fired up here today in the City Council. I'm going to turn back now to my colleagues to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Traeger. We've been joined by Councilmember Ulrich, Moya, Kalos, Borelli, Powers, and Jonai. And we have questions starting with Councilmember Grodenchik, followed by Councilmember Reynoso.
Thank you, Chairs. Good morning, Chancellor. Good morning, Ms. Grillo. We still see you there. Don't worry. We know you're here. I got 3 minutes to go over the entire education budget of the city of New York. I do want to reiterate a lot of what the chair said. Chancellor, I have excellent educators. I have 32 schools in my district, between 26, 29, and District 75. I'm proud of each and every one of those principals and the people that work in those schools. And there is nothing more important in my visits to schools that has been impressed upon me than increasing the allocation for fair student funding. And that's the glue in many ways that fills in gaps that otherwise are not going to be filled in. And I want to impress on that. I know I've mentioned it to you, but here we are today, and I'm just going to continue to talk about that. I appreciate I want to zero in on one thing that has bothered me. I appreciate the advancements we've made in computers and the education of our children, computer science, computer technology, especially the increases for young women. Robert Kahn, who is the co-inventor of the Internet, people have heard me talk about that, is a product of the New York City school system, graduate of CCNY. So there is a precedent here for great things. The thing that troubles me and troubles many of my colleagues is that if I don't buy technology for the schools, they don't have new technology. We are spending almost $34 billion a year. $34 billion a year, and I have to go from school to school and provide them not with 25 or 50. Most of my schools get $100,000 a year for technology, because without me, there is no new technology. I have visited schools. Fortunately, this has been abated, but my first tour of the schools, I ran into schools where some of the technology was nearly a decade old. And I just want to know, also want to follow up the iPads. Everybody wants them, we can't buy them. And I guess maybe we should talk about that further. I'd like to know what we're doing to increase and update the technology in our schools so that I can spend my money on doing new playgrounds with Miss Grillo.
So I'll say a few words, and I'll ask our CFO to answer some of the more technical parts of your question.
You got 22 seconds. Go ahead.
I have 22 seconds. I'll be quick. I agree with you. I think technology is incredibly important. It doesn't replace teaching, but it facilitates learning for students. I can tell you that in the 14 months that I've been here, we have doubled the bandwidth that schools have and accelerated even the connectivity for schools. Part of the strategic plan, the 5-year capital plan, has funding in it for technology as well. We are also working with, and I have partnered with the city to work with business and industry around an initiative of getting some technology into our schools so that they have a place to, a piece of the pie, if you will. We are in the process of hiring a new Chief Information Officer, a new Technology Officer position, and job number 1 will be a master plan for the modernization of our technology in our schools. And the other thing that I would say is in terms of the budgeting and the contracting and the procurement of certain kinds of devices, we're actually taking a very deep look at that, because we do want to be sure that we can support what schools get, but we also want to make sure that what schools are getting are what they want to be able to use. So I'm going to ask our CFO if she has any additional comments.
Yes, thank you, sir. So in addition to that, one of the opportunities that will roll out this coming school year is the Smart Schools Bond Act funding, which you may recall came into existence in around 2014. It took us 4 years to work with the state to get that technology plan actually approved. It happened this past, at the end of 2018, and we will be rolling out those dollars, those allocations to public schools. It'll mean $106 million to support devices, equipment, devices in schools. Laptops and tablets are included in that, and so we will be rolling out that funding throughout the upcoming school years. And so we're really excited about that opportunity. It obviously, those devices only work so much as they can hook up with the broadband that we are pushing out to schools. So while we have been pushing out the broadband to schools, these devices will be a nice complement to the increased broadband in schools. In addition to the state reimbursement funding coming to us, there's $750 million in the capital plan that supports technology upgrades. And so we are constantly working on that and refreshing the circuits in our schools so that they can support the new devices they will receive.
Thank you. I was recently at Van Buren, and you know I talk about that all the time. They inducted the CEO of Thermo Fisher Scientific into their Hall of Fame, and he brought along $30,000 worth of new science equipment. And I was happy to see mostly young women in that class and mostly children of color. And Ms. Grillo, I need a new field there. I must have one. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Sure. Let me just say, how did you get around the prohibition by the Controller's Office on the tablets?
So the tablets are specifically called out in the state rules around the Smart Schools Bond Act, and the state program is a reimbursement program that will not run through the city's capital program. It actually will run through our expense budget, so there will be no bonding out for devices.
Do you know how much that's going to cost for the tablets?
It's $106 million to support new equipment in schools, and that will roll out. There is no end date for that money, so we will be rolling it out to schools over the next several years.
Is there a priority to which schools they go to? Because special education, it's especially important for those kids, I think.
There is an assistive technology component that is associated with that funding, but it is a per capita based dollar value for schools, and there will be more guidance coming to schools in the fall. We are looking at the economic needs of schools as we are considering this allocation.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much. Councilmember Reynoso, followed by Councilmember Brannan.
Thank you, chairs. Thank you for being here. To all, I just saw a couple of things. First, I don't want to speak to who wrote it, but there was an article written recently here in the city of New York related to the work that you're doing to work against implicit bias and diversify your team. And for a long time, people of color have had to go above and beyond to prove their worth in a lot of the work that we do. And for you to acknowledge the fact that we need to start shaking things up to get new outcomes, I'm extremely proud. I was proud to actually see your name on that. Wear it as a badge of honor. And if you need anything, please look to me as a partner. Absolutely. The next thing is what we have here. This is the greatest school in all of the city of New York, the greatest middle school in all of the city of New York, the school I went to, Junior High School 50, or MS 50. Can you guys just stand up? I want them to be acknowledged and so that folks can see. All right. I just need them to move around. All right. You guys need to shake it up a little bit. The great thing about Junior High School 50 is that they are a nationally recognized debate team. They will be going to nationals soon to debate against other states, I guess. But one thing that I can't get past is that the reason they have a debate team is because they have something called ELT, or extended learning time. And it is something that is being considered for a cut by this administration in a time when I agree with our chair of education. We are not in fiscal constraints right now. We've actually given the Department of Education $600 million worth of savings that they can take up. On top of that, they have another $500,000 that they found in April 15th outside of the $2 billion that actually already existed in the surplus. So the fact that these young people that have, because of the funding that you've given them, been able to put themselves on the map, a renewal school losing students and underachieving, underperforming statistically, now has turned that around. They're increasing their student population. They're a nationally recognized debate team. Their performance is going up. Their attendance rate is going up. Everything that you would ask for, they've done. This school has done it. And now they're being threatened. We're threatening to cut their extended learning time. So I want to have a conversation with you about the debate, how that debate would look, where I would have two of these young students sit against you, Carranza, so that you would have to be on the side of saying extended learning time can be cut in schools, because they would happily argue that it shouldn't be cut, and they are a testament to that. I just need you to help me, help you explain to them why extended learning time is not of value. But you guys can sit down. But thank you so much for being here, Junior High School 50. We love you very much. And because my time is going to be done, I do want to also ask, related to breakfast in the classrooms, yeah. I need to see statistically as well. I'm a Junior High School 50 kid. I just need stats and data to show that breakfast in the classroom is not working. I don't mind you showing me, if it's not working, then we can have a conversation. But from everything I've received so far, it's actually showing an increase in the amount of students that are eating breakfast. And I just don't want another plan. First, extended learning time and this are two models that have shown success, and I don't want to move away from things that are working, Chancellor. There's a lot of things I think might not be working, but these things are working. So those are my two questions and statements.
Okay, so first and foremost, you really want me to debate against one of these young championship debates? I'm out of my league. I'm going to tell you right now, yes, I'm scared. So ELT, again, I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with the chair more. Again, we had to make some very difficult decisions. One of the priority areas that we have is if there is additional dollars. This is one of those things that is prioritized to come back. That being said, as we considered whether ELT would be one of those budget cuts, we actually met with principals, we talked to principals, we asked principals, especially in the Renewal Rise cohort of schools, of all of the components that you had at your disposal, what is the most important thing, and are there any components that were not as robust or didn't give you as much as what you need? The number one thing that all of the principals said unanimously was, do not cut our fair student funding formula. Because in our renewal schools, in our RISE schools, we lifted all of those schools to 100% FSF. So that's why you have seen there is no proposal to cut that. The second thing that they said almost unanimously was, do not touch our community schools approach. In other words, having a coordinator, helping them to make connections with community-based organizations. You will also see that that was not proposed as well. For a good majority of the principals, they spoke very highly about their extended learning time. But there were a number of principals that
Followed by Gibson.
Thank you, Chairs Drum and Traeger. Good to see you, Chancellor. Good to see you, Ms. Grillo, and your wonderful staff for being here today. We really appreciate your testimony, as always. First of all, I just want to commend you for the work that you've done across the board in all of our districts in bringing and doing your best to try to create the equity and equality in our schools that we so desperately need. New York is the most segregated place in the nation, as far as I know. So thank you for all of your help in trying to get us to the place that we need to be in a whole. That said, I'm going to go into the bleak part of my line of questioning, and that is that I have a problem. I have an issue with the optics of this budget. I have a very big problem with the optics of this administration, and the more we look at this executive budget, the more that we dig deeper, those of us that are on the budget negotiating team, the more troubling all of this gets. We're right now looking at an administration who doesn't seem to care that the optics are problematic across the city. We're looking at closing senior centers. Now we're looking at cutting breakfast for children. We're looking at not funding or not giving more thought to pay parity and social workers, Title IX. The list goes on and on and on, and the optics are horrendous. So I'm just going to switch gears just a little bit. I had to get that off my chest. But I'm in a district that is represented by a large number of co-located schools, which has been an issue of mine for a very, very long time. I've always been adamantly opposed to co-location. So we've been talking about cutting school breakfast, but in co-located schools, we have something that is known as 10 o'clock lunch. I never understood it. Maybe you can explain it. We know that the USDA mandates that schools offer lunches between 10 and 2, but how many New York City schools offer lunch earlier than 10 a.m.?
I can get you that specific number and follow up. I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay, then I'll ask, why are schools allowed to offer lunch earlier than 10 a.m.?
So I share your concern, and a few months ago, I publicly stated that we are reviewing all of our lunch times in our schools. That's really, really important. It also relates to not only lunch times, but start times as well. If I may, and I just want to tell you, as a high school principal, in Las Vegas, I had a school that was built for 2,700 students, and we had a student population of 4,000 students. The cafeteria was built to serve 2,900 students. So in a very real sense, I was serving lunch. I was one of those 10 o'clock lunch servers because I could only fit so many students in my cafeteria at a time, and I needed to have 6 lunch periods. So we had to start at 10 to be able to get them all through by 2. It was just a matter of logistics. It was horrible. We ended up working out a solution, which I'm not even going to mention publicly because it was crazy, but it helped in that situation. In many of our co-located facilities, and I also share concerns about co-locations with you, it is really a matter of just the physical plant and how you can accommodate students. That being said, there are ways to be creative and thoughtful about how we serve lunch. And part of our analysis is actually understanding what are the issues? Is it a facilities issue? Is it a scheduling issue? Is it a food provisioning issue? What is the issue? Because I guarantee you, whatever the issue is, we can find a way to make it so that students aren't eating brunch. They're actually having lunch. So we share your concern. I personally share your concern as well on that issue.
Thank you.